Hey, good evening, everybody. I'm going to be doing the multitasking as I do the introductions to this slightly different looking meeting of the Cambridge Seminar on the Future of the Island of Ireland. This is, as you've seen, it's a camera on meeting, so it's more intimate and hopefully more enjoyable for everybody. So my name is Barry Colfer, and I'm the co-convener of this seminar along with my colleague Niamh Gallagher. Niamh sends her best and she'll be back shortly from leave. This is our 25th meeting of this seminar, and the back catalogue of all the meetings we've had are available on our carefully curated website, which the details of which will be shared in a moment. This series came together, first of all, under COVID, as I think I recognise some of you on the call will remember. It was mainly in the first instance, recreational and just to kind of get us through the dark days, but it was trying to bring matters of Ireland and the island of Ireland to Cambridge, to a wider UK audience, and indeed to others. And now UK-Irish relations are in a different standing, a better standing all around, I hope. And now we are taking the chance to look at some really important and I think really, really interesting, but inevitably more technical things about the island of Ireland and its place in the world. And what better place to start than by looking at the sea, and specifically the governance of our oceans with Vice Admiral Mark Mellett. And Mark, thanks a million for being with us as ever. We're going to be looking at questions of security, questions of energy, critical infrastructure, climate change, biodiversity, among much else. So I'll introduce Mark in a second and we'll ask him to kick off. But just a couple of very short notes of housekeeping as ever. Our speaker, Mark, will speak for 20 to 25 minutes. He has a PowerPoint presentation. The proceedings today are being recorded as ever, and they're going to be carefully curated into a piece of writing by our research assistant, Iona Clark, who is on the call, and it'll be available for consumption that way as well. And of course, I was trying to just interpret my own handwriting there. This is a cameras on meeting as well, so everyone can feel free to turn your cameras on if you wish, and when we get to the Q&A, please just unmute and put the question to Mark. So to introduce Mark Mellett, Mark is a Vice Admiral, was Ireland's highest ranking military officer. He was the government's principal military advisor and member of the National Security Committee and the EU Military Committee. Mark has served as a specialist naval diving officer, seagoing commander, and he's also served in Afghanistan and Lebanon. Mark led the COVID-19 military response in Ireland. He is recipient of 2 Distinguished Service Medals, and on behalf of the President of the French Republic, he was appointed to the rank of Commander in the National Order of the Légion d'Honneur. Appointed by government as board chair of the Maritime Area Regulatory Authority, MARA, Mark is also board chair of SAGE Advocacy and council chair and board member of the IMI, the Irish Management Institute. Mark is an adjunct professor at University College Cork, holder of a PhD in ecosystem governance, and founder of Green Compass. Mark provides strategic advice to governments, industry, and environmental NGOs. He speaks about courageous leadership, climate change, and sustainability. Mark, thanks as ever for being with us, and I'm going to hand over to you now.
Barry, listen, it's great to be here, and forgive my screenshot if it looks like I'm a ghost peering out of the sea. That's because I'm sitting in a hotel room here in Dublin just after a great event up in the Institute of International European Affairs. I don't own the setting, but I do own the slides, and I'm going to just share my screen with you now, and hopefully we'll be able to run through these fairly quickly and take it from there. So I basically want to just talk about our shared oceans, the challenges and opportunities, and many of you will recognize this picture is just a snapshot of the interconnectors between ourselves in Europe and North America. And we'll come back to those in the course of my discussion. But challenges, there are many. Opportunities, there are a few. And I'll work my way through those. But first of all, maybe a small bit of history in terms of, and it won't move. So we'll just see if we can get it here. Yeah, the challenge of governance. The sea is one of those things which cannot become private property. No part can be considered as the territory of any people whatsoever. And in the words of Hugo Grotius, about 400 years ago, he is a Dutch jurist, And in many ways, what he was doing at that stage was establishing one of the principles that remains today of law of the sea, that is the principle of mare liberum, freedom of the seas for all to use as they see fit. The challenge, however, was that Grotius also made remarks with regards to other areas relating to the ocean. He said something, and paraphrasing along the lines, that everybody would admit that a forest can be denuded of animals and a river can be denuded of fish, but such an occasion could never happen in terms of the ocean. Today, most fishery stocks are stressed beyond commercial viability, so he wasn't quite correct there. But Mare Liberum, which was written in 1603, sets out the principle of law of the sea, and so it stayed with us for about 400 years until we came towards the middle of the last century, in which case we had conflict of interest from fisheries, recreation, shipping, infrastructure, military activities, protected environmental areas, and so much more. So much so that as it came to the convening of the Law of the Sea Convention, and the chairman of the drafting committee, Sir Alan Beasley, made this remark: the law of the sea was in a state of disorder bordering on chaos. And so the new principle of mare clausum, or the enclosure of the sea, was codified into much of the UNCLOS agreement, an agreement which is, by many would say, is one of the most comprehensive multilateral legal institutions that have been crafted throughout the international community. Not everybody accepted law of the sea, and it has been ratified by many countries, but there are a number of exceptions. In particular, USA still has not fully institutionalized the law of the sea agreement, and that's a challenge in the context of the potency of that institution. That being said, most countries conform with the principles and the provisions in the articles of the UNCLOS 3, which more recently has been joined by another piece of legislation, which I'll talk about shortly. In short, the law of the sea tries to make provision for competing rights in terms of actions at sea, and giving a series of responsibilities and also obligations to states, so that the space itself can be looked at in terms of its multidimensional factors. That is, it has 3 dimensions in terms of the usage of the sea. It have obviously a seabed, you have the water column, you have the area in terms of the surface of the sea, and the area above. The law of the sea provides for a number of jurisdictions which are of interest, and very often, and just came from a discussion where people were talking about the territorial seas of Ireland, and very often when they talk about territorial seas, they often mean to include the exclusive economic zone, but the exclusive economic zone is not part of the territorial seas. Territorial seas extend out to 12 nautical miles from the coast, and for all intents and purposes, the laws of the land apply out to that point. And thereafter, you have a contiguous zone and an exclusive economic zone that runs out to about 200 nautical miles, or around 400 kilometres. Beyond that, you have the extended continental shelf, which extends the jurisdiction, in some cases, such as Ireland, nearly to 1,000 kilometres offshore. In the case of Ireland, this is our area, and I just want to look briefly at it in terms of governance from a national level. We in Ireland have sovereignty over the territorial seas, which go out to 12 nautical miles from the baseline, and then sovereign rights over the seabed and subseabed and the water resources out to the exclusive economic zone, which extends to 200 nautical miles. Beyond that, there is an area called the extended continental shelf, and this is subject to a number of agreements with the UN Commission on the limits of continental shelf. Ireland has submitted a number of claims. Some have been adjudicated and some have not. Like the UK, similarly, we have an agreed median line to the north and an area of claim which was lodged in 2009 with the Commission on Limits of Continental Shelf in New York. This has not been adjudicated on. We have common cause with the UK in terms of a similar claim has been lodged by the United Kingdom with the Commission on Limits on the Continental Shelf. But this is also subject to a competing claim from Iceland and Faroes. And the governance really is that these are concluded by a diplomatic process rather than a competitive process. So it remains to be seen will this ultimately be an area that will have Ireland will be able to exercise jurisdiction over the seabed and subseabed resources. That said, if you look globally, a significant portion of the ocean is now captured in terms of sovereignty or sovereign rights. So much so that it is about 40% still remains in areas beyond national jurisdiction. If I carve it up this way, you can see the area of land on the Earth is about 30% of the total sphere of Earth. And beyond that, then, we have an area of about 42%, which are areas of the ocean that lie beyond national jurisdiction. And that brings us then to about 27%, which is captured by exclusive economic zones or areas of the extended continental shelf. Just this year, a new treaty, which I wrote about, and you'll find it online, the High Seas Treaty, also known as the Agreement on Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction, or the BBNJ, has come into force. Now, this is still being institutionalized and being accepted by the various parties and will take some time to become normalized into an application of law. It will cover areas such as minerals beyond national jurisdiction and other activities, in particular, such as illegal, unreported fishing. And it actually gives a stronger platform to deal with this important area beyond national jurisdiction, where there are significant governance shortcomings up to its institutionalizing. But the ocean, for most of us, they are the arteries of global commerce. When we look at the shipping lines throughout the world, about 90% of our trade by volume travels by sea. And it's a significant consideration when it comes to security. And not just in terms of transit on the ocean, in the area above it, in terms of our air domain, which is of significance. You can see throughout the world the major flight paths with a huge concentration in the area over Europe itself. About 90% of the traffic between North America and Europe transit through airspace, which is under Irish aviation control. Of significance also is the fact that this domain has been challenging in the past. And I just recall 3 flights that were lost. Air India, which was lost in 1985, and I was involved in the search for the black box of Air India, a huge depth of water, about 180 miles off the southwest coast. More recently, we had Air France in 2009 on a flight from South America to Paris, which was eventually the wreckage located by autonomous vehicles, I think from NOAA. And then we have the Malaysian airline still not found in the area to the east of Africa and to the west of Australia. Of course, there are this concentration of, I suppose, air routes makes it a challenging governance requirement in terms of authorities trying to delineate between competing demands for airspace. Of course, fisheries, and we're well aware in terms of the activity of fisheries. This is just 1 year's screenshot of fisheries off the Irish coast, which is quite significant. And I'll touch on that towards the end of my discussion in the context of the challenge with fisheries and the declining fish resources that impact all our countries. For illegal activities, our oceans have been used over the decades, such as narcotics, with the shipment primarily of opiates from Asia into Europe, and cocaine, and that through directly from South America or through the Gulf of Guinea into Europe and beyond. There are also the utility of our ocean space in terms of hydrocarbon exploration and mineral exploration. And increasingly, we're seeing an increase in prospecting for mineral activities in that area beyond national jurisdiction, which makes the recent High Seas Treaty significant in the context of bringing some governance to bear on that. Maritime terrorism is a feature, and of course the sea lines of communications are not discerning in terms of who uses them. And these shots on the right of your screen is the Marita Ann, which was a major IRA shipment from North America that was taken off the Valhalla and intercepted by the Irish Navy. And then we have the actual the attack on the coal, which happened off Yemen more recently. Of course, increasingly we're beginning to see the use of the sea for irregular migration, and we've had some very challenging discussions on that over the last number of years. And just to focus back in the last major crisis related to irregular migration in the Mediterranean, 2015, 2016 and 2017, and our own Defence Force, in fact, I was Deputy Chief and then Chief of Defence when we responded in support of Italy, initially on a bilateral basis, to deal with these very challenging numbers that were actually, to some degree, being exploited by criminal gangs who are shipping, I suppose, irregular migrants across the Mediterranean, through the central Mediterranean route, and also from the east into Greece and beyond into Italy. In that time, we saw terrible statistics. The Irish Navy at the time rescued over 22,000 people. We saw hundreds of people drown and we recovered many bodies. It's a significant challenge in terms of governance into the future. And with regards to changes in climate change, I think this is going to be a feature into the future itself. So just, I suppose, to capture a few global security trends, I've mentioned the obviously challenges in terms of Ukraine. We have the war in Gaza. We have also the insecurity across Sahel, which continues to be a factor to some degree, also stimulating irregular migration. But we have the migration challenge, which currently is not at the level it was a number of years ago, but remains a concern. And into the future, I believe, will be triggered again with changes in climate. And I'll speak about those shortly. Of course, we have the old tradition of piracy, Southeast Asia piracy in the Horn of Africa, which to some degree has been controlled, but increasingly we're seeing a rise in the incidence of piracy in the Gulf of Guinea. And then we have sovereignty tensions, the traditional sovereignty tensions in terms of the China Sea, in the context of, I suppose, the interpretation of the law of the Sea Convention in the context of extending jurisdiction from China, and increasingly as a consequence of climate change and the new access available as a result of the receding Arctic cover, sovereignty challenges in the Arctic, which cause tension between the various states in that region. And of course, the narcotics shipments from South America through the Gulf of Guinea and also South America directly into Europe itself. So looking at some negative vectors in terms of ocean governance are the impact of climate change, the impact of population increase, with some estimates saying that the population of the continent of Africa could double by nearly 2060. We have greater urbanization and we have a decline in resources, and I'll talk about that briefly when I come back to the drivers of climate change. But on the positive side, we have extraordinary growth in technology, automation, robotics, and the explosion in data and knowledge, which all leads to the capacity for the human beings to deal more effectively, certainly from a technological point of view, in terms of ocean governance. The challenge, however, remains, and we've seen I suppose the risk to critical infrastructure, the attack on Nord Stream, which in itself released around 7 million metric tons of greenhouse methane into the atmosphere. Methane is 30 times more potent than carbon, and secondly has had a large impact on the carbon footprint as a consequence. We're seeing it also in the context of questions over data routes, data cables, interconnectors. If we look at it in terms of the dependency on data, about 15 years ago, the amount of data that exists in the world was in the region of 1 zettabyte. That's 1 zettabyte is 10 to the power of 21 bytes. By 2025, just a year after next, we'll have about 185 zettabytes generated. Data drives information, which underpins the creation of new knowledge, new technologies, and new ways of doing things. So the importance in terms of fiber optic cables and their dependency in terms of our interlinkage with global communications, global commerce, and global trade cannot be underestimated. This picture, I say, was taken on the 4th of November 1958. Actually, it wasn't, but it did look like that on the 4th of November 1958. And that was the day I was born, a Tuesday. And what you're seeing are a shoal of orange roughy and a cold water coral reef, Lophelia pertusa. Lophelia pertusa is a cold water coral reef that runs all along the Atlantic break, off the west coast of Ireland, off the west coast of Scotland, right up to Norway. It's an extraordinary rich biodiversity. It really was and is at the heart of a healthy, vibrant ecosystem 60 years ago. It's just as rich as the Great Barrier Reef off the coast of Australia. But in the years that followed, these fish, orange roughy, were targeted. These individual fish that you see in this picture, some of them were swimming when Darwin was on the Beagle. They lived to be over 200 years of age. So the targeting of this species was never sustainable. The habitat in which they live, the cold water coral reef, could take up to 8,000 years to form. And yet, within minutes after a net is dropped, it turns into a rubble heap. And not only were the fish no longer there, the orange roughy had been fished to extinction, much of the rich biodiversity in the area has also been damaged beyond recovery. And this is the penalty in terms of anthropogenic activity, the impact of the human on our ecosystems. We don't talk about this often. We talk about the rainforests in South America. We talk about vulnerable land ecosystems, but it's just the same at sea. And when you consider other factors and other drivers, it is worrying in terms of what we're seeing in the context of our oceans and the governance of our oceans. And align that with other factors, such as a 65% loss of vertebrate wildlife in the last 50 years, and a 75% reduction in insects, including pollinators, in the last 30 years. It leads to a worrying trend, but it doesn't stop just there. We look at the skyrocketing carbon, and it's interesting that we're having this discussion in the middle of COP28 and the recent exchanges in terms of between our own former president, Mary Robinson, and the president in terms of the actual discussions on the impact of fossil fuel. The science is clear. There is an extraordinary link between fossil fuel, the carbon footprint, and the rise in temperature. When I was born 65 years ago, my first breath of air, there were 313 parts per million in that breath of air of carbon. Today, each breath that you take as you listen to me, there are 420 parts per million of carbon. And as we predict to the future on the basis of the Keeling curve, and Keeling is a professor in Hawaii who in 1958, the same year I was born, started recording the actual carbon content within the atmosphere. And his curve has continued on to this date in 2023. And if we predict that forward and look and see when will we come to net zero, it looks like it will be in the region of 2080 or thereabouts, at which stage the carbon parts per million in the atmosphere will be 480 parts per million. Net zero. Net zero does not mean zero carbon. It means we stop increasing the amount of carbon. And the relationship between that in terms of climate is worrying. Right now, we're on track potentially for up to 2.7, maybe even 3 degrees rise in temperature beyond pre-industrial levels, which is a worry for us all. We're already seeing the impact of climate change as a result of temperature rise across all parts of the sphere. So much so that last year, the World Economic Forum pointed to the top 3 risks in terms of the next 10 years were climate related. And this year they updated to the top 6 risks are climate related, including number 5 there, large scale involuntary migration. So the challenge is there for us all to address the governance issues around addressing the actual impact of climate and what it means for us all. On every sphere, the cryosphere, the hydrosphere, the lithosphere, it is going to be quite challenging in the context of the changes we will see in terms of degradation of resources, changes in climatic conditions, and what it means for the Anthropocene. I touched earlier on the issue of data, and data for me is a differentiator. If we look back in the past, there were 5 major extinction events. The last 2 in particular were reptiles and dinosaurs. Neither was responsible for their actual extinction event. They didn't even know it was going to happen. And even if they did, they could do nothing about it. Humans are different. We have an extraordinary intelligence. We have a capacity to drive, an extraordinary capacity for knowledge and technology. So there is a potential for us to be able to arrest the impact of climate change by shutting off the actual carbon release, which is so interlinked with the increase in temperature. And by shutting that pipe off, we actually mitigate the risk of rising temperature in the future. And one way to do that is to harness our energy in terms of the maritime. Right now, if we look at it in the context of where Ireland's jurisdiction, indeed UK's jurisdiction, but in particular to the west of Ireland, we sit alongside the richest accessible renewable energy resource on the planet, in particular in wind. You can also see in the South Atlantic a significant area where the energy is similar, but nobody lives there. You can see it to the west coast of the US, primarily to the west of Canada. Very few people live there. And you can also see it to the east coast of Japan. Unfortunately, the waters in the east coast of Japan are about 3,500 meters deep and very challenging in terms of harnessing that. There is this area here in the middle of Asia. It's on top of the Himalayas. Nobody lives there yet anyways. So the opportunity is here in terms of exploiting that renewable energy resource, and the technology is there. It's there in the context of up to 15 megawatt turbines, fixed, jacketed and floating. I had the pleasure of visiting Kincardine off the Scottish coast recently to look at the first largest floating wind energy resource, and there are other technologies moving as we speak in terms of tidal and wave. So just coming to a conclusion, in the context of the governance of our oceans, just like everywhere else, we need leaders in sustainability who are going to move away from business as usual, where risk is going to increase and resilience is going to decrease, and we're going to have challenges for ourselves, to that societal transformation required to actually institutionalize sustainability, make it a norm in which we're willing to actually punish ourselves if we are not acting sustainability. And the key differentiator for that is going to be courageous leadership. In terms of governance of the ocean, the top priority remains an effective implementation and enforcement of the vast range of international ocean law now available. Our governance in the ocean will be driven by 3 institutions: the government and policy, the market and enterprise, and people and values. Market doesn't always tell the ecological truth. It's important that we've got good policy, and it's important also we have active citizens in terms of contributing to that governance regime. Mary Parker Follett said, and I'm paraphrasing her, leadership is not so much defined by the exercise of power, but by the capacity to create that sense of power in those who are led. The real role of a leader is to create more leaders. So if you take away one thing from my discussion about ocean governance, I want you to be leaders for sustainability. Barry, back to you.
Mark, thanks a million. That was as interesting and as wide-ranging as I expected it to be. And there are some really nicely done slides. I really liked some of the visuals you had there. I took kind of 9 or 10 different themes down from your presentation. I'm going to ask you about a handful of them in the next kind of 50 minutes or so. And if anybody on the call would like to say anything, put a question or pass comment, please just raise your hand. At the very top, Mark, you spoke about UNCLOS, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. Does it require any updating based on what you've said? Like, it has been a while since I've looked at it. I remember as a student spending time with it, as a law student, but does it have what is required to meet the challenges of the modern ocean and modern ocean faring?
Yeah, I suppose there's a dilemma there in terms of it's not being fully institutionalized by some countries, and I'd rather see what's in it being actioned rather than adding to it. I think that the High Seas Treaty has given an additionality to it that actually is beginning to address those areas beyond national jurisdiction. And that's important because that to some degree was an area, excuse me, that was an area, am I still with you? Just an area open to open access, which means that there were no real rules and no enforcement. So the High Seas Treaty, together with the institutions of the Law of the Sea Convention, I think what we need to do is put more shoulder to the wheel in trying to get those actioned, rather than adding to the raft of legislation that's there. We're not great at enforcement globally. And yet it is going to be critical that we do just that, in particular in the context of what's coming down the track in terms of climate change.
Really. And are there any, just without putting you on the spot, is there anything specific within the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea that you think is underutilized or underappreciated?
Well, I think the obligations on states with regards to good governance from the point of view of protection of the environment, that's a clear requirement. And my story there about cold water coral and orange roughy, that's replicated throughout the world. That's to a large degree, we have had a very, I suppose, simplistic interpretation of environmental governance of the ocean. And I would say we've given a free ride to the fisheries industry, in particular on bottom trawlers, beam trawlers, without asking the questions with regards to what care has been taken of these vulnerable. My own research, my PhD is in that very area. Who owns biodiversity? Well, actually, you do. I do. It's part of the actual sovereignty and the obligations of the state. Now, since then, I've become a little bit more nuanced on that. Actually, none of us own it. We're all part of an ecosystem. And perhaps the more we find ourselves and can nest ourselves as being an organism within the ecosystem that actually is very sensitive to externalities that we cause, and so that our actions are internalized, that we capture all the costs of our actions. And if we were to do that, if we were to price carbon properly, we wouldn't be having the problems we are today. But carbon is not priced in terms of the destructive potency of that molecule.
It is actually, it's really quite remarkable how wide-ranging your discussion is, Marcus. I want to ask you something about security in a moment, but it could equally be we can continue talking about biodiversity and climate change and critical infrastructure and the rest of it. But there's a question from John Ranelagh, how are you, John, on one of the other topics you discussed, which pertains to energy. And as we can all see, John remarks, wonderful that Mark is able to end on a positive note. Indeed, thanks for that. However, wind turbines are machines and machines break down. So is there not an economic cost and possibly an ecological cost to maintaining them? This pertains to Ireland and indeed Britain being the wind shahs of Europe, Mark, and making use of the windy and relatively shallow waters compared to the waters you mentioned in Japan, for example. What are the potential economic and ecological costs of maintaining wind turbines if they're distributed at scale?
Yeah, and John has made some good points. I think at the moment the best bet we have is to drive on with wind turbines. They're moving, as I said, they're currently approaching 15 megawatts. I know they're on the boards for up to 20 megawatts, maybe even 22 megawatts. These are behemoths. They're bigger than the Eiffel Tower, extraordinary, bigger than any ship I've ever commanded. I mean, you're talking about between 6,000 and 7,000 tons in terms of floaters. The point is that the technology capacity to build these exists, and the reality is, yes, of course there will break down, and of course there will be redundancy in an O&M, an operation maintenance program associated with those, like any industry into the future. There is a question then with regards to, and we hear this regularly, what happens when the wind doesn't blow? And there are a number of hedges for that. First of all, if you take the distribution in terms of wind energy on the western waters of Europe, there's always going to be wind somewhere. But I'm not getting out of jail on that. I'm actually pointed towards other technologies. And right now I'm aware of a very interesting technology off the Portuguese coast, a full-scale wave energy device that has been feeding into the grid for the past number of months. I've tracked that for the last couple of years in the development of that technology. I actually attended its Iron Man test in Sweden, where it was developed over 30 days, full-scale machinery test. And I have the confidence that wave energy will come in as an augmentation of wind energy. And then, of course, you have tidal energy. Now, not everywhere is suited to tidal energy, but the northwest or northeast coast of Ireland are suited in the area of Rathlin. And there are areas around Scotland that are ideally suited. Of course, the coast of Brittany, where there's significant tidal races, are suited to it. On the ecological side, I actually have to position renewable energy, offshore renewable energy, against the other activities that are there at present. And if I look at it in the context of the impact of a floating wind turbine with 3 sea anchors versus the damage done by a beam trawler or a bottom trawler, which is pulling a rockall hopper, which is probably 5 tons of foot rope, with roller balls half the size of human beings over delicate ecosystems. I think the biodiversity net gain associated with offshore renewable energy wind farms will be such that you will actually have a spillover from areas around wind farms of biodiversity gain, and fisheries will be richer on the edges of these areas as long as there's no take in the area itself. So I do see certainly a penalty, but it's a minor penalty in terms of ecological impact. I'd see the dividend in terms of biodiversity net gain in the area of wind farms as being extraordinary, allowing biodiversity to recover significantly.
And just, I mean, you make such a compelling case, as do others, Mark, to the uninitiated like myself, to the kind of value of these technologies at sea. And can you help me understand the reason why this isn't a bigger thing yet? Is it cost? Is it the unseemliness disrupting the skyline, which is sometimes referred to? Is it the technology isn't adequately advanced yet? Is it the ecological risk? Can you point towards any other reasons why there aren't kind of wide-scale wind projects?
Politics and institutions. So
usually those two.
Yeah. So I have absolutely full confidence in technology. The technology exists, and but the difficulty is institutions they change in small steps, and the politics are such that I recall back in 1999 I was attending the War College in Newport, Rhode Island, and as part of our field trip we went down to Washington, and we had an afternoon with a lobbyist. He was a lobbyist for Marlboro cigarettes. I couldn't believe that even in 1999 there was a lobbyist in Washington whose full-time job was to lobby politicians to make it more attractive, more conducive for the cigarette industry to prevail. We have lobbyists for the fossil fuel industry. We have subventions into the fossil fuel industry to keep it actually competitive. If fossil fuel and the price of carbon was properly priced, we would have renewable energy long ago. So that's where the impediment is. We have to actually be aware that there is a very, very strong coalition trying to keep business as usual, trying to maintain technologies that actually are well past their sell-by date, that are actually doing so much damage in the context of the driving the existential risk to population. The potential in terms of 1 degree increase in temperature is somewhere in the region of between 2 and 3 billion people will be sentenced to areas of the world which are uninhabitable. 2.7 degrees above pre-industrial levels is a worrying scenario.
This is a brilliant discussion, Mark, because it's something of universal application, but in the kind of parochial tradition of this series, or we're trying to look at the island of Ireland, I want to bring one question kind of close to home. Given the nature of politics in Ireland, which I know you're extremely familiar with, are there any other kind of political veto points from communities or the citizenry who might resist the development of these things offshore? Are you talking so far offshore that it can't be considered a nuisance to people, or have you anything to say on that?
You can take it every constituency will have its say. And while you can see I'm absolutely convinced on the merits of the technology, democracy has a penalty in terms of the rights of individuals to have their say. And the challenge is such that sometimes in terms of the perfection of democracy is such that we will end up with very, very challenging institutional roadmaps that we must follow, which mean that some of the decisions that we need now won't be forthcoming. Perfection is the enemy of the good. We need good now. We need to actually stimulate this industry. And it's you see it every day in terms of the objections to developments. But if I was to say that the time for us to actually move this industry to a level whereby we decarbonize is now. Every fraction of a degree matters. And right now, the world is pushing 37 billion metric tons of carbon into the air every year. And the science has never been more clear.
It's truly sobering, Mark. There are three themes I'm going to touch on really briefly with you. One is going to be on critical infrastructure, perhaps predictably, then one on security, and then finally one on the COP. So that's just to put everybody on notice. If anybody wants to put anything else to Mark, comment or a question, please take the chance to do so in the next couple of minutes. On critical infrastructure, Mark, it's something I know you know a great deal about, and it's been covered widely enough in Ireland over the past months, probably in excess of a year now, given the kind of vulnerabilities around certain parts of Ireland's subsea infrastructure around the internet cables, the transatlantic internet cables and data connections, which you mentioned. Could you just narrate that a little bit again for a non-expert audience? And firstly, if you could just describe what the threat is, and secondly, is it really a genuine threat? You mentioned Nord Stream. I know that was a very specific case, but in the Irish context, are there genuine risks to critical infrastructure? And if so, what should policymakers be doing to try and address that threat?
Well, I think this is a debate in every country, certainly in the European Union. I had the pleasure of attending the North Sea Summit earlier this year, and all of the members of the North Sea Summit were exercised and seized by this. There are states that are actually carrying out reconnaissance activity in the area of critical infrastructure. We've had, and it's open source, Russian Federation, I suppose, vessels working over cables that are actually connecting the North Atlantic through our jurisdiction. We are aware in terms of reconnaissance of wind farms, of interconnectors, and the challenge remains that this now is a new potential target, if not actually a target, in the context of hybrid activities. That and I'm aware that the Russian Federation is on the record that they see this type of infrastructure as being a legitimate hybrid target.
And is there anything meaningfully that could be done by Ireland or other European countries to try and, protect themselves against that nature of hybrid threat?
This is a whole of government response. And what I mean by that, in fact, it's more than whole of government, it's whole of society. If we take the dividend we have in our jurisdiction in terms of a sea space whereby we have sovereignty and sovereign rights, and the freedoms we get in terms of recreation, in terms of fishing, in terms of transport, in terms of other actions, there is also a duty on us, I think, to actually be alert to other activities that are not in the norm and to actually report accordingly. Critical is the requirement for recognised maritime picture, and then leveraging technologies in terms of autonomous surveillance technology, synthetic aperture radar from satellite technology, and more to actually ensure a timely response where there are actions that are seen to be challenging.
You okay?
I'm back.
Good. Thanks very much, Mark. Penultimately, I want to ask a related question. And when I initially asked Mark to participate in this conversation, and indeed to go into the Island of Ireland series back catalogue for posterity, I was thinking of a security angle, given that Mark is one of the best regarded authorities on Ireland's security context. And it's a very interesting time for one to be interested in questions pertaining to Ireland's security context and its international security context. We've had a recent exercise by government to consult with the public on Ireland's future stance with respect to its international security. Recently, government have announced the intention to remove one of the three parts of our triple lock, which prevents the deployment of, Mark will correct me, more than 12 military personnel overseas without the triple lock being Cabinet, Parliament, and until recently, the Security Council. But what I want to ask, Mark, is how these questions about the sea, the oceans, or the subsea infrastructure, the wind farms, even things like biodiversity loss, how does that cross over with any country, but let's talk about Ireland, with Ireland's capacity to defend its seas, to understand who is in its waters, to be able to respond to threats when they arise? And is Ireland in a position to adequately protect its seas?
Well, I think institutionally Ireland has a challenge in that, and this goes back to the foundation of the state. Article 6 of the treaty in 1921 said until we had the wherewithal to provide for our own coastal defence, it would be provided by His Majesty's Imperial Forces. We're back now with His Majesty's Imperial Forces. We still haven't adequately developed the capabilities to uphold our sovereignty and sovereign rights. And sovereign rights that are not upheld are more imaginary than real. So I think it is interesting we're having this debate at this particular time. But I think it's beyond the capacity of any one state to uphold its responsibilities. And multilateral frameworks are the best way to do just that. And certainly, while I'm not going to advocate for joining NATO, I will say that there is an opportunity for greater congruence with regards to the institutions of the EU to actually strengthen the capacity of individual states to feed into a more common capacity and response in terms of capabilities to deal with international shared areas such as the maritime. And on the same tone, since Brexit, I think there is a responsibility on us to strengthen the bilateral relationship with the UK in terms of defence and security. Otherwise, the scene will be exploited by actors that have neither our interests in mind and will seek to undermine our interests. So bilaterally, the issue is also coming to the fore in the context of common energy requirements, the use of supply chain, common starting points in terms of ports, interconnectors, and sharing power, sharing load. So there's a lot of reason for us to really leverage what we should be doing is multilateral frameworks to have a more common sense approach to our ability to provide security for the state and for the citizen and for other activities such as market and enterprise.
And are you aware, just before I get to my very final question, Mark, are you aware of anything that has either been forced or that has become more obvious since the UK's departure with respect to what you just discussed, the capacity for bilateral engagement between Ireland and the UK, maybe Ireland turning more towards other EU countries since the UK's departure? Has anything changed at all in the past 7 or 8 years since the UK's departure?
Well, I know I just left a dialogue at the Institute of International European Affairs on that between Germany and Ireland. And it was good to see parliamentarians from both countries discussing those very issues. And I have attended dialogue once again in the Institute between UK and Irish politicians on the same matter. So our politicians are exercised in terms of landing at the right point in terms of policy formulation. But, you know, I think there's an education piece also, Barry, that's required. And institutes and platforms like this are important so that the citizen can't abdicate on her or his responsibility with regards to seeking the political decisions required so that we're not left in a position where our sovereign rights are more imaginary than real.
Very, very clear, Mark, as ever. And tonight I'm wearing my Cambridge hat. So I'm a fellow in politics at the University of Cambridge, but Mark has name-checked my other employer, the Institute of International European Affairs, which is doing great work in trying to feed into that education piece to give people the vocabulary to try and discuss these really important and also extremely interesting matters. Mark, a final one for me is it's always a pleasure, but it's been a real pleasure, and the breadth and scope and depth of your knowledge is always humbling and always so clearly presented. I could learn from you about how to explain really complex matters in such simple and clear and interesting terms. So just thanks a million. I want to ask you about COP. You mentioned it's taking place at the moment. I think probably everyone on the call knows people who are there trying to do good work. Do you have any reason for optimism, or just any thoughts you could share about how the narrative or indeed activity may change on foot of this COP for good or for ill?
Yeah, I think, well, I suppose just the two contrasting positions, the pessimism of the intellect or the optimism of the willing. I am naturally an optimist because to actually fall into the trap of being a pessimist is to abdicate on never giving up. And as Nelson Mandela said, it always seems impossible until it's done. I'll be frank, I don't expect the outcome to be earth-shattering. Nevertheless, I will see an incremental ratcheting of the actual isolation of the fossil fuel family, and that more and more they will be called out. And a tweet a few weeks ago, we had a recent storm coming in, and I named it after one of the large petrochemical companies. And we should do that. We shouldn't be naming storms after nice words like Diane or Fred. We should call them after the creators of those storms, and that's the hydrocarbon industry, because they are actually driving the actual the change in climate that is making it more and more challenging. And let's be clear, in the first few months of this year, we've had over 50 or 60,000 people displaced because of climate impact. We've had nearly 12,000 people lose their lives because of climate. So this is the start of the future unless we actually have outcomes. The other piece that I think is interesting from COP is, and I hope that, and Minister Ryan, our own minister, in the last COP27, was a key driver in the loss and damage. We must recognise that an extraordinary burden is borne by populations that have absolutely no hand or part in terms of driving climate change. And yet they are the very ones in theatres like Africa in particular that are being impacted by rising temperature and resource degradation. So loss and damage is critical in the context of addressing the adaptation and mitigation measures required there. And if we don't do that, given the point I said earlier on with regards to population changes, we will be triggering irregular migration at a level that we haven't seen before. So the investment needs to go to countries at source rather than dealing with the symptoms in theatres like the Mediterranean, which we had a tragic duty to do in 2015, 16 and 17.
Mark, thank you so much. As well as kind of sounding that call and highlighting those real threats, your presentation has also set out some kind of actionable and realistic solutions to the crises that we face. So it's both sobering and humbling, but also slightly, we can end on a slight sense of hope as well, which is a rare thing. So thanks a million for your time, Mark. And as ever, it's great to spend a bit of time with you. Thank you for those of you who stayed on the call, and thank you to Iona Clark, sorry. Iona Smith. Thank you to Iona Clark, our research assistant, for pulling this all together, and I look forward to seeing the fruits of this event once it's written up. Thank you, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mark. Ciao.
All right. Bye.
Long live.